Okay, we're glad to be back again for another episode of This Week in Christian History, where we always get to learn a little bit more about some particular subject that would have happened in this particular week. And so this week we are focusing in on June 22nd, 1758, which is the day that Jonathan Edwards, who is certainly not the B team and not a sloucher as it relates to church history in the U.S., was actually dismissed from the church that he was pastoring. And being able to talk to us about that is Dr. Matthew Everhard, who is a good source of knowledge for all things Edwards. So we want to learn more about all of that. But thanks for joining us today, Dr. Everhard.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for having me. I love Jonathan Edwards, and I'm excited to talk about the time that one of America's greatest theologians got fired from his job. An exciting turn, a little bit of a twist in church history there.
Yeah, I love the whole idea. I mean, how do you go from being, a rock star and doing one of the most memorable sermons in all of American history, probably, but not only that, but certainly within American church history, that you get that kind of a famous for that big of being doing sinners in the hands of the angry God, and then turn around and 8, 9, 10 years later get fired. So that's a great story we want to hear about. But building up to all of that, tell us a little bit more just about this guy Edwards. I mean, where did he come from?
hmm
How did he get to where he was? How did all of this kind of fit, and how that fits maybe into the Great Awakenings or anything else that you think would be important for us to know about?
Yeah, so that's great right there. If we want to frame up Jonathan Edwards' timeline, we can think of him as being somewhere between the Salem witch trials in 1690 and the American Revolution in 1776. So his dates of life are 1703 to 1758, and he happened to be right in the very center of the First Great Awakening. And the First Great Awakening we typically locate at about 1740 to 42, a couple of years there. Some people stretch that a little bit further on either end, but I think that the Great Awakening, pretty much 1740s, and Edwards is there. He's a local pastor. His main job, his daily job, is he's the pastor of the Northampton Church, and his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, had been the pastor of that same church before, and Edwards joined him as the assistant pastor. And then when Solomon Stoddard died, Jonathan Edwards became the senior pastor. And of course, we do know him probably most for that famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which was right in the center of that Great Awakening revival. And Edwards wrote a number of very important books, treatises, major books, sermons, of course, private journals and devotions and things like that. And so he is a greatly beloved character for many who love the history of the Great Awakening.
How about that? So Northampton is where? Where is it located? Where's
Well, right along the Connecticut River Valley, and
okay.
Northampton is, of course, one of the main churches around which this great revival took place. And in 1734 and 35, Jonathan Edwards, now the sole senior pastor of the Northampton Church, he saw his own what we call the local revival, which broke
Mm.
out just a few years before the Great Awakening. And Jonathan Edwards experienced with his congregation this great movement of God's Spirit, in which a number of people experienced regeneration and were baptized and were received into the church as communicant members. And this revival spread around that Connecticut River area. And then Edwards wrote a book about that experience called A Faithful Narrative, which kind of put him on the map theologically. He became something of an expert in revivalism at that point.
Well, when we a couple of questions, things, a bunch of stuff just flows through my brain when we're thinking about all this. But if people were to kind of keep in context today and have some kind of a reference of what you might think of as a revival, uh,
hmm
uh, my guess is if anybody's got some kind of a current context of that, it's um, big tent set up somewhere. You've pounded the drums. You've said everybody come in. We're all having the meeting time. Bring the tambourines. Show up down at the big camp meeting, and or this is going on at a particular church, and get the folk from the hinterlands back in to be able to come hear the revival piece. Is that accurate for the kind of thing that was going on in that revival that was taken on in Northampton?
Yeah, so a little bit. I'd say yes and no to that question. On
Okay.
one hand, the First Great Awakening can be distinguished from the Second Great Awakening in the 1800s, which is a little bit more flamboyant in terms of some of those like big tent revival meetings and things like that under Charles Finney. However, in the First Great Awakening, when Edwards was alive, there was a contemporary called George Whitefield, who was actually an Anglican preacher. And when he came to the colonies, it made a major splash. In fact, Whitefield was famous for preaching out of doors. He would often preach to slaves and coal miners and the poor, and the people absolutely loved George Whitefield. So it was not altogether unexpected for Whitefield to be able to gather a crowd of more than several thousand, sometimes as many as 10,000. And
Wow.
Benjamin Franklin even calculated at one point that maybe as many as 20,000 people came out to hear George Whitefield. So Whitefield is a contemporary of Edwards. The two knew each other. They spent some time together. Whitefield visited Edwards's home and Edwards's church. But many of the revival meetings that Edwards would have been a participant in were not necessarily like that. Many of them
Mhm.
were just sermons in their own churches. And oftentimes they would trade pastors around a little bit and do what we call itinerant preaching, where one preacher visits another preacher's church and things like that. But notably, the revivals in the First Great Awakening really stirred up the town. It was the towns, it was spread all the way across the colonies, which is why we call it the Great Awakening.
Mhm.
And people came to faith by the scores. And as I mentioned, many of them became communicant members of their churches, and many of them really did experience marvelous works of God's grace in their lives.
How about that? So, um, what denomination was Edwards?
Okay, so that's a great question. Today, we would consider him a congregationalist. Now, theologically, he would align as a Calvinist, and he would not align with what he would call Arminianism in those days.
Mhm.
But he was congregationalist, meaning that there was an autonomy of local church governments. And congregationalism we could distinguish from the Anglican Church, which has a series of bishops which have authority over various regional churches. And then Presbyterianism, which is the idea that churches are associated in presbyteries of local, same minded leagues of churches. So Edwards was technically a Congregationalist and a Calvinist theologically, though he did participate in something like a presbytery, which was called the Hampshire Association. And that was several churches, maybe a dozen or so churches along the Connecticut River Valley that often did things together, cooperated together, and helped each other. So, in one sense, he's kind of a proto Presbyterian, although their formality is less structured than in a traditional Presbyterian denomination.
Okay. So could you have been I'm taking a little turn here, but could you have been a Congregationalist and been an Armenian?
Certainly that was possible, and there were some who were Arminians and were Congregationalists. But in Edward's day, and certainly prior to that, Calvinism is the dominant motif of most of the theologians, preachers, and pastors. There are some studies suggesting probably more than 90% of pastors in those days were Calvinistic in terms of their orientation. At the same time, because of the congregationalism, one of the features thereof is that churches can call their own pastor. They're not assigned to them by a bishop or a presbytery. And so certain churches would have called more Arminian leaning pastors. And just like today, influence comes in from the coasts and from the universities. And as Yale and Harvard, the two original seminaries, began to move away from traditional Calvinism, you did see an influx of more Arminian influence. And by the way, Edwards was strongly against that. Edwards preached and wrote very often against Arminianism in favor of Calvinism. So we can definitely chalk him up as being a Congregationalist and a conservative Calvinist in his day.
Yeah, yeah. In our mind, we might kind of think, hey, there's kind of two components. We got both the chocolate and the peanut butter here, right? I mean, there's the governance of the church itself and how it's governed and how it's structured and kind of what that might be church polity, things that we're kind of maybe using seminary-ish words, about to be beyond my thinking and my learning enough to know that. But I mean, but then there's also the theological piece. And so those kind of coming together, that's really what we could maybe define Edwards as being, both Congregationalist in the way that the church operated, but theologically certainly rock solid Calvinist, right?
That's exactly right. And interestingly, as we turn into some effect to the firing of Edwards, both
Mm-hmm.
of those things really come into view because the congregational polity, where churches are essentially autonomous, that really gets a bit muddled in the firing of Jonathan Edwards because we have a theological controversy that's going to lead to his downfall with his people. But because they did not have strictured ways of firing a pastor, it wasn't very
Uh,
easy. Part of the problem with Edwards losing his job is that the church didn't quite know how to fire him correctly. And so there's a series of sort of botched attempts to get rid of Jonathan Edwards. And other churches are actually going to have to intervene to try to help to sort out matters.
well, that's a great segue, okay, for us to kind of be able to talk about our conversation today. We're enjoying our dialogue and conversation with Dr. Matthew Everhard to talk about the dismissal of Jonathan Edwards, but also to be able to talk more about Edwards and his legacy. So tell us that story. I mean, what led up to that, and then what happened on the back end?
Yeah, great question. So it's hard to imagine that America's premier theologian and one of the most famous pastors could get fired from his church, but that is in fact what happened. Edwards began to lose some respect amongst his congregation for a series of what we would consider minor pastoral missteps that ended up being major in the long run. The first thing that Edwards did is because he recognized himself as something of a genius, and he knew that, and we know that today too, he didn't visit his church very often in terms of pastoral visitation. So
Uh,
Edwards did not have the relationship with many of his congregants that he probably should have because he preferred to spend much of his time alone reading and writing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Edwards mismanaged a controversy amongst the young people of the church in an event called the Bad Book Case. And I'll
hmm,
be brief here, but some young men of the church got hold of a midwifery volume, which had
okay.
some graphic depictions of the female anatomy. And they used that to mock and to jeer at some of the girls in the church. And Edwards basically called the entire youth group out after church one day, naming pretty much everybody in the youth group, but he failed to distinguish the accused from the victims of this mocking incident. And so many parents got mad at Jonathan Edwards because the way that he named the youth involved seemed to imply that they were all guilty, whereas in fact there was only a few of the boys that were guilty. So Edwards lost some respect there.
Hmm.
So those two things. But here's the major thing that really happened. Edwards wanted to make the policy of the church's participation in the Lord's Supper stricter than it had been in the past. Now, here we have to connect Edwards to his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. Solomon
His
Stoddard
maternal
had a
grandfather, right?
his
Obviously,
grand
right?
yes,
I
his
mean, right?
maternal
Okay.
grandfather, that's correct, who was the pastor of Northampton. Um, he had a rather loose policy on church participation in the Lord's Supper, wherein anybody could participate in the Lord's Supper as long as they had been baptized and as long as their life was free from obvious scandal. But they did not have to necessarily express a conversion experience. So Solomon Stoddard thought of the Lord's Supper as being a converting ordinance. You might actually get saved while you participate in the Lord's Supper. But Edwards disagreed on this matter, and he wanted to reverse it back to a stricter policy wherein, in order to apply to be a communicant member, you'd have to give a viable, credible experience of God's saving grace in your heart. And some of the people that were participating in the Lord's Supper had not been able to do that. And so therein is the major friction between Edwards and his church.
So maybe just kind of putting that in a more practical way. Hey, my Uncle Fred is here, and we want him to be able to come to church and let him participate, and maybe he hadn't been as many Sundays as we'd like to have him to been, but by golly, he was raised up right enough to know that he needed to be in church, and you get him up there and you won't even let him do the Lord's Supper. I mean, what the heck? I mean, maybe I
Yeah.
way oversimplified it and didn't
No,
look
that's
that way,
that's exactly it.
but then the
And
people go, man, uh-uh. and you get this from where? Okay. We get it that you're, this great big dog, but at the end of the day, you're still our pastor here in this church. And there's a big disconnect here, Jonathan. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. So here's what would have happened. So you'd have quite a few people at Northampton that had already been participating in the Lord's Supper. All of a sudden, they would no longer be able to participate because they'd never come to the pastor and expressed a conversion experience. So you'd be reversing your policy on a number of people that were already in the church. And then, secondly, the next effect would be that Edwards did not want non-communicants to be able to baptize their children either. And that was going to be a major problem because if you couldn't participate in the Lord's Supper, Edwards didn't think that you should have your children baptized. So the congregation was very much a stir of this, and that began the process of trying to get rid of Jonathan Edwards as their pastor. There was just too much; they couldn't take that.
so in using kind of modern day kind of Presbyterian way, there was a thought process. There was no session to be able to bring him to, right? Or there was no way that you could have gotten other churches per se in a more structured way, like if you were in the Anglican church or you were in some other spot to go, hey, time out. This guy over here at this church is not doing this thing right, and there's no governance, if you will, that comes down on him and says, man, you're going, this is a tenet of what we're about. And if you're not going to follow along with this, then maybe you need to go some other spot. Is that oversimplifying it, or is that
No, I think that's largely correct. So if they had been Anglican, perhaps a bishop could have got involved to straighten out the situation, but they were not Anglican. And
right?
if they had been Presbyterian, there would have been a presbytery that would have considered these charges against Edwards, but they were not Presbyterian. So this leaves it to the congregation and Edwards to figure out the process that they're going to use to try to get rid of him. Meanwhile, Edwards believes that most of this is just a misunderstanding, that if he could explain his theology of the Lord's Supper to them, then they would be convinced and they would see that their pastor was right. So Edwards wrote a book about this topic, but unfortunately his people were not really interested in reading it. And so Edwards pled with the church to let him preach on the Lord's Supper to try to convey his position. But again, the church council refused that. So he tried to do some Thursday night lectures to explain his position, but again, the congregation did not show up.
Huh.
So unfortunately, that left them in the awkward position of having to negotiate a kind of council trial in which they were going to consult other churches in the area in something of an ad hoc church council that would eventually be entrusted with the decision of whether Edwards should stay or whether he should go.
So the toothpaste was out of the tube by that time, right? I mean,
Yes, it
it's
was.
just not the point of the Rubicon had been crossed, right? I mean, they'd had about all they were going to hear from it. And
Yeah, that's right.
yeah.
And so the first thing they had to decide is who's going to adjudicate this ad hoc council. Now, Edwards knew that a number of churches that were close proximate to Northampton were siding with the congregation, and they disagreed with Edwards's stricter policy. So Edwards wanted to try to consult some churches that were a bit farther away, and that too became another element of the controversy. Eventually, the negotiation that they came up with is that they would choose representatives from 10 other churches. Edwards would get to pick five of those churches. The congregation would get to pick five of those churches. And then two of those 10 could be from further away.
Wow.
And so eventually you have 10 other churches that are going to get pulled into this, each one of those churches sending two delegates. And that council then was going to decide the fate. They were going to hear the charges on both sides. They were going to listen to both considerations, and then they would be entrusted with making the decision. Now, one of the things that the council used to try to determine this was a congregational vote. So they asked the congregation, why don't you vote on this? And so they did. And when the Northampton church took their vote, only 23 of the male members of the congregation supported Jonathan Edwards, and a total quorum of 230 men who were voting. So basically, only a tenth of the membership of Northampton supported their pastor. And so when the council made their final vote, it ended up being a pretty close party line vote where Edwards lost by a vote or two, but he'd lost already in a landslide in the congregational vote. And so it was pretty
Mhm.
much determined then that Edwards would be out as the pastor of Northampton.
Yeah, you could have won the battle, but you weren't going to win the war, right?
That's
And
right.
so if that's the case, then maybe I need to go on and do other things, like I don't know, be the president of Princeton or something, right? Maybe there's there could be other things for me to be able to do, right?
Yeah, so Edwards really was in a between a rock and a hard place because he had a large family. He had 11 children. They had farmland that actually the town owned. And
Hmm.
so awkwardly, after they fired him, they still had him preach for about a year, though it was very strained and awkward because they had fired him. And the town council even voted that Edwards couldn't even use the pasture land to feed his own animals anymore. So it was a real financial hardship for Edwards at this time. And basically, there were three options left for Jonathan Edwards. First, he did receive some invitations to come to Scotland and become a truly Presbyterian pastor in the Church of Scotland, as
Okay.
invited by his friends, the Erskine brothers. His second option would be to remain in Northampton and try to begin a splinter church. And he did have some supporting members. Remember, 23 voted in his favor, and that's only the men. Edwards believed that if the women were allowed to vote, then he would have had a closer to, well, he would have done better in the vote. So there was some momentum for Edwards to simply begin a rival congregation. But
Yeah.
then ultimately, he was going to be called to the fringe of society at a mission outpost called Stockbridge, where Edwards would be called to pastor a small English speaking church as well as a Indian speaking congregation as part of some missionary endeavors. And that's exactly what he ended up doing, taking the missionary call to the Stockbridge settlement and becoming something of a missionary to Native American Indians.
And that's something. And then after that, then he goes on to be president of Princeton. Is that right? Or
Yes, sir, that is correct. So he's going to spend several years at Stockbridge, about 6 or 7 years, if I'm not mistaken. And he's going to do fairly well in Stockbridge. Matter of fact, being away from controversy frees Edwards up to do the very thing that he really wanted to do all along, which is to write doctrinal theological treatises. That's what he really wanted to do. And he ends up writing some of the best things there. His famous book, Freedom of the Will, will be written there, as well as a philosophy called The Nature of True Virtue, a philosophical theological work called The End for Which God Created the World, and so forth. And then finally, towards the very end of his life, he's going to get called to become the president of Princeton, but he really only takes up that charge for a matter of a couple of months before he ends up dying, which is its own story.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Another great story for another day. How about that?
Yeah, perhaps.
We don't want to wear you out on part of this, but here's a guy, right? Not only just had all this, but I saw somewhere, if my memory's not totally messed up, of all the people who can literally claim Jonathan Edwards as their as their ancestor. I mean, isn't Aaron Burr one of those, and several U.S. presidents and or senators and all kind of people, a ton of pastors and others can all kind of go back to those 11 youngins, right? And how what that
Absolutely.
legacy
Yes.
was.
Absolutely. One of the most tremendous early colonial families, of course, pre-revolutionary. Edwards did not live to see the American Revolution. But yes, absolutely. And certainly Aaron Burr Jr. Now, Aaron Burr Sr. was a pastor and a Presbyterian scholar, a good friend of Jonathan Edwards. He had married Edwards's daughter. And Aaron Burr is the president of Princeton who dies, and then Edwards is called to take over his son-in-law's
Oh,
job. But it's Aaron Burr Jr. who fought in that notorious duel with Alexander Hamilton. So when you're thinking of him, the future vice president, that's Edwards's grandson.
gotcha. How interesting. So fascinating to be able to follow. Well, tell us more about kind of how you got interested in Edwards like this, and tell us more about some of the good work that you're doing and how people could connect back and learn more about not only the work that you're doing, but also of being able to learn more about Edwards.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. A couple things that I've written that might be of interest. My doctoral dissertation is called A Theology of Joy, Jonathan Edwards and Eternal Happiness in the Holy Trinity. So that's a little bit of a theological book, but it's not beyond the head of the average person because it's mostly on the topic of joy or happiness. And
Mm,
so I really started to love Jonathan Edwards because of his theology of joy and happiness. And that's what drew me in to become an Edwardsian scholar. I also have a book on Jonathan Edwards' 70 resolutions, which he wrote when he was 19 years old. It's called Holy Living, Jonathan Edwards and the 70 Resolutions, so you can get that. Both of those books you can find on Amazon.com. And if you're interested in following more of my contents, I do a lot of videos on YouTube,
mm.
youtube.com/Matthew Everhard, and I do all kinds of videos on there. But I do have a whole playlist of Jonathan Edwards related videos, and I'm about to do another one tomorrow. So you might want to check that out.
Yeah, absolutely. You can get your fill, okay, of all things Edwards in one spot, all right, or that could be connected on part of that. Well, I know in addition to your role as a pastor and as a professor, we're just glad that you made a little time for us today to help us learn really a fascinating story as it
Well,
relates
thank you
to.
so much. I'd love to come back sometime and talk more with Jonathan Edwards. If you ever want to focus on more of the Great Awakening, that great revival of God in the 1740s, or perhaps I could tell you the interesting story of how Edwards died. That's a neat one in its
How
own
about
right.
that?
Yep.
Yeah, that sounds like a great, and that's a great segue for me to talk about our Christian History Chronicles. Those are the kinds of stories that, in addition to what we do on the podcast, are uh, much larger time frames. And we, of course, for those who are interested, would be able to connect into the Zoom link and be able to get on the conversation with us and be able to ask certainly more questions than I would have come up with. So that's another part of all of that to do. So Dr. Matthew Everhard, thank you so very much for being our guest today.
You are welcome, my friend. God bless you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.